My husband abandoned me for my mother but returned when he realized she wouldn't receive any inheritance, leaving me with everything. Hi, I'm in a real predicament right now because of my unstable mother and my equally foolish soon-to-be ex-husband. Together, they've conspired to completely ruin my peace of mind, all driven by their own selfish greed. I wish I could confide in my friends about this, but it feels too personal and humiliating to share with anyone I know in real life. Trust me, you'll understand why once I explain what I'm going through. I don't have much family to lean on, so there's no one else I can turn to. That's why I'm reaching out to the Reddit community, to vent and also to ensure that I'm not being painted as the villain in this situation, which is how I'm currently being portrayed. This entire ordeal began just 2 weeks ago when, out of the blue, my husband of 3 years, let's call him Kevin, told me he wanted to break up with me because he had developed feelings for my mother. Yes, you read that correctly. And no, I'm not making this up. Believe me, I was as shocked as you are and, honestly, even more disgusted when he confessed that he had been having an affair with her for the past 3 months. I had never suspected anything because I was preoccupied with work, and his behavior had never raised any red flags that would have made me notice. To provide some background, my mother is only 20 years older than me. I'm 27, and she's 47. She had me while she was in college, but my father was never involved in our lives. He broke up with my mother the day she announced her pregnancy and even tried to convince her to terminate it. However, she wanted an excuse to drop out of college, so she decided to have me instead and informed my grandmother that she intended to become a single mother. My grandparents were wealthy enough to support her decision, but they were still unhappy about her dropping out of college. They attempted to persuade her to return to school after I was born, but she refused. Instead, she dabbled in various professions before settling on interior decoration, not as a designer, but more as an advisor on furniture placement and room aesthetics to make spaces visually appealing. It's a high-end market, so she became quite adept at it. Although she isn't a certified professional, my grandfather was a renowned realtor, which helped her secure jobs. My mother is the most unreliable person I've ever known, and she's fortunate to come from an affluent family because otherwise, she would have ended up homeless. I was essentially raised by my grandparents because my mother never had the time for me. She was always busy with work and social activities, living a carefree lifestyle while I was growing up. In fact, during my childhood, I genuinely believed that my grandparents were my biological parents and that my mother was just my older sister. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had lost all hope in my mother because she remained as carefree and irresponsible as she had been in the past. My grandfather passed away when I was in 7th grade, leaving me alone to face the world, including my difficult relationship with my mother. Most of the time, dealing with her was a complete nightmare. Imagine having to explain to your 15-year-old self why it's a bad idea for your mother to travel to Iceland with a man she met on Tinder just 2 days prior. That was my teenage life. She's utterly clueless and has no regard for how her actions impact others, not even her own family. My grandmother had instilled in me the notion that I would be on my own once she passed away because my mother would never be of any assistance to me. As a result, I worked incredibly hard and climbed the corporate ladder to become the chief operating officer at my current firm, earning double the amount my husband does. Kevin is the head of sales at a smaller company, but I never looked down on him or made him feel inferior. Part of the reason for this was my education. I graduated from one of the top business schools in the state and interned at the company I now lead, thanks to my grandmother's connections. She taught me to stay humble, unlike Kevin and my mother, who both believed they were major stars despite lacking substantial achievements. I met Kevin at a mutual friend's birthday party about 5 years ago, and we clicked instantly because we shared many common interests. We dated for 2 years, and when he proposed, I didn't hesitate to say yes because I believed he was a good man. At least, that's what I thought at the time. He would often joke about how attractive my mother was, which wasn't entirely untrue. While I would never describe her as hot because she's unstable and, well, my mother, I can't deny that she meets the beauty standards for her age. She's made a significant amount of money by deceiving people into believing that her so-called fang decor works. A lot of that money goes into makeup and Botox, so she maintains her attractiveness for her age. I don't mean to belittle the professionally trained interior designers, and perhaps her methods have some merit, but in reality, my mother's work is a scam because she knows nothing about it. I respect those who are genuinely skilled, but since my mother doesn't qualify as one of those professionals and is generally a terrible person, I feel justified in criticizing her. I believed Kevin would be different from the other men I had dated in the past and that I could trust him, but I was wrong. He made jokes about my mother being attractive enough to pass as my sister, and despite my strained relationship with her, I laughed along because I never thought something like this could actually happen to me. I had maintained contact with my mother only because of my grandmother, who made me who I am, and for that, I am eternally grateful, even though it meant dealing with her psychotic behavior. My grandmother never gave up on my mother because she believed my mother was a good woman who loved her daughter despite all her flaws. On the other hand, my mother could never bring herself to love me more than herself, no matter how hard I tried. Even after my grandmother passed away almost a year ago, I continued to reach out to my mother. Our relationship was terrible, but I still felt obligated to look out for her, more out of duty to my grandmother than for her sake. However, everything changed when Kevin confessed the affair 2 weeks ago. Kevin sat me down one evening after I returned from a business trip and calmly told me that he was in love with my mother and that they wanted to be together. At first, I thought he was joking and laughed it off, but he didn't laugh this time. Instead, he went into detail about how he and my mother had been involved behind my back for 3 months. We had a petty argument and my mother had texted him seeking advice on fixing her headphones, which is how they started talking. Their friendship gradually turned into something more, something they hadn't intended, but it just happened, and they couldn't control themselves. I suspect Kevin was also attracted to how much my mother resembled me. I kicked him out that very night, and he left without much of a fuss because he knew he could just go to my mother's place instead. I must have cried my heart out that night, finishing an entire bottle of wine while sobbing uncontrollably until the early hours of the morning. Overwhelmed by anger and pain, I decided to text my mother. I was drunk, which likely pushed me to send that message. I hurled a lot of insults at her, calling her a terrible daughter to my grandmother and a horrible mother to me, and said she was only getting worse with age. I accused her of being a con artist at best and predicted that once her Botox and fillers wore off, Kevin would see her true, ugly self and abandon her too. I didn't expect her to respond, but she did, and her reply was truly eye-opening. She told me that while she might lose her beauty one day, she would never lose her financial stability, which was about to increase tenfold thanks to my grandmother's will. I had completely forgotten about the inheritance while grieving my grandmother, but her lawyer had informed us that we would learn the details of the will after the probate period, which was supposed to take about 6 to 9 months. It had already been several months, so we were expecting to hear from him soon. My grandmother had instructed her lawyer not to disclose the specifics of the inheritance until the probate period was over. The only thing we were allowed to know was where she wanted to be buried. So, neither my mother nor I knew exactly what we would inherit. However, since she had substantial money, assets, and property, we were anticipating a significant inheritance, or rather, my mother was, because all I cared about at the time was that my grandmother was gone and I was truly on my own. The contents of the will didn't matter much to me because, regardless of the amount, I value relationships over money. But clearly, Kevin did care about it, which is why he chose my mother over me. Both of them must have been confident about the inheritance because my mother had been boasting about it as if she had already received confirmation from the lawyer. I didn't respond to that text and tried to push it out of my mind. The very next day, I spoke to my lawyer and told her I wanted to file for divorce as soon as possible. Within a week of Kevin's confession, I filed for divorce, and he was officially served. Now, all we had to do was wait for the process to conclude so he could spend the rest of his life with his ex-wife's mother. But then something miraculous happened, and I truly have to thank my grandmother for it. Even after her passing, she still looked out for me. I had requested my grandmother's lawyer to inform us separately about the inheritance because I couldn't bear to be in the same room as my mother and Kevin. 5 days ago, she informed me that my mother had already been told about her inheritance and that it was now my turn. I visited my mother with no expectations because I had no idea what would happen. However, as I left, I realized I must have been the happiest person on earth at that moment. I had inherited all of my grandmother's money, assets, and property, while my mother received nothing except a diamond ring and matching diamond earrings that my grandmother used to wear. Apparently, the reason my grandmother left everything to me was that I had taken care of my mother her entire life. Now that my mother was approaching 50, she was old enough to start looking after herself, so ironically, my grandmother, who had always told me I would be on my own after her passing, had ensured I was independent enough not to rely on the inheritance. The one person who had depended on my grandmother her entire miserable life was left with absolutely nothing. It was karma at its most vindictive, and I felt more justified than ever in that moment. My mother had learned about the inheritance just an hour before I did, but I didn't know what would happen next. I was thrilled because I knew that even if my mother didn't try to reach out, Kevin surely would, and that's exactly what happened. Instead of patiently waiting it out, Kevin texted me the very next day, claiming he had made a huge mistake and wanted to come back if I would still accept him. He said that he and my mother were never meant to be together and that spending those few days with her made him realize how much he valued our relationship. I couldn't help but laugh out loud when I read his pathetic attempt at reconciliation. They probably had no idea that I knew my mother had inherited almost nothing and that there was no significant inheritance to anticipate anymore. After a whole day of contemplating how to respond to Kevin, I finally replied to his text with a clown emoji and then blocked him. I was also certain that he wouldn't come clean to my mother either, so to cover all bases, I took a screenshot of his message and sent it to my mother along with 3 clown emojis. I then turned off my phone because I didn't want to deal with the inevitable drama that was about to unfold. Instead, I chose to watch Netflix and enjoy my evening without letting Kevin or my mother bother me anymore. The next morning, I learned about the aftermath of my text from my mother's next-door neighbor's daughter, who is also my friend. She informed me that my mother was still living in the house I grew up in. For your information, my grandfather had left that house to his wife and daughter to live in, so after his passing, my mother continued to reside there. The neighbor's daughter told me that around 10 p.m., she started hearing a lot of yelling from my mother's place, but no one bothered to check because their family knew what kind of person my mother was and didn't like her at all. Then, suddenly, there was a loud commotion, which finally prompted them to come out. My unstable mother had physically ejected Kevin from the house, leaving him lying on the pavement while she hurled all sorts of things at him and screamed the most vile and disgusting insults. Kevin had screamed in pain because my mother had grabbed a hardcover book and thrown it at him, hitting him directly on the forehead. When the neighbors found him, he was already injured and trying to stop the bleeding with his hand. He had a deep gash that required 5 stitches, which was horrifying to hear. Kevin pressed charges against my mother, and although she only had to pay a hefty fine because it was classified as a misdemeanor, it was still terrifying since Kevin was genuinely hurt. She hadn't intended to harm him, and she wasn't in her right mind at the time, so the police let her off easily. It also helped that she had a very good lawyer and was friends with the district attorney's wife. Upon returning home, my mother blamed me for everything and texted me a barrage of horrible messages from her second phone number, which I hadn't blocked yet. I've been trying my best to ignore them, but I can't help but wonder if what happened was really my fault. What Kevin and my mother did to me is undeniably unforgivable, but now I feel like I should have just counted my own blessings instead of trying to interfere in their lives and mess things up for them. My actions were driven by spite and anger, and I'm not even proud of them. If I had known that sending that screenshot would lead to such extreme consequences, I never would have done it. I only wanted to make them both feel bad, not to cause anyone to get seriously hurt. My mother has never had a history of physical violence, at least to my knowledge, so this was something I could never have anticipated. I feel terrible about what happened, and my mother's constant attempts to portray herself as the victim and make me look like the bad guy are only making things worse. Even Kevin has been posting cryptic quotes about betrayal and other related topics, which is highly ironic. But that's beside the point right now. I feel like they're trying to make me out to be the villain to shift the blame onto someone else, but I don't know what to do. I'm guilty of trying to ruin the relationship between my mother and soon-to-be ex-husband after my mother bragged about how she stole my man with an inheritance she barely has, which isn't even true anymore. Thank you all so much for your incredible support in the comments. I appreciate all your kind words, especially those who were honoring my grandmother. She was truly one of a kind, and I consider myself very, very lucky to have had her in my life. Her generous personality during my childhood somewhat compensates for having a mother like mine. I don't feel guilty anymore about what happened because, in reality, they ruined my marriage, so I ruined their relationship in return. My mother was the one who lost her composure and attacked the man she supposedly loved, so I'm not going to feel bad about that at all. She's the crazy one here, not me, and she certainly isn't going to make me out to be the villain when she did everything wrong. Kevin got hurt, and while I do feel sorry for him because physical violence is never justified, he's the same guy who cheated on his partner of so many years with their own mother. That's just disgusting. I can't imagine anyone believing they have the right to ask their partner to forgive and take them back after doing something like that. He betrayed both me and my mother. I'm sorry he got hurt, but that's not my fault and not my problem either. So, I've decided to block all of them on every single platform imaginable. Heck, I even blocked my mother on PayPal to show how serious I am. On a serious note, I've also been contemplating a restraining order because my mother has lost all sense of reason. There's no telling what she might do next, and if she's upset with me for ruining her relationship, she might target me next. I don't want that, but I also don't want to give up the home and career I've worked so hard for and relocate just because of my mother's instability. A restraining order seems like my best option to protect myself from this unpredictable and destructive person. Update 2, it seems I might have to file for a restraining order after all. I had ignored my mother completely for almost 2 weeks and was starting to move on. Kevin had also responded to my divorce petition and wasn't contesting it, so things were beginning to settle down. With extensive therapy and self-love, I believed I would finally overcome this nasty incident. Unfortunately, my mother decided to return and continue her torment. Yesterday, I found her waiting for me in my front yard right outside my door. I had just returned home after a long day at work and was in no mood to deal with her. I told her to leave or I would call the police from inside my car, but she refused to budge. Instead, she insisted that she wanted to talk to me about the inheritance. I told her she could speak to me from a distance because I was curious about what she had to say. She plainly stated that she wanted half of whatever I had inherited because it was only fair since my grandmother was her mother, not just my grandma. I actually laughed in her face and told her that she was the last person who should be talking about what's fair. Then I told her to leave because I wasn't giving her anything and dialed 911 in case she tried anything out of line. She glared at me and began walking toward my car. Instinctively, I rolled up my windows just in time because as she approached, she gave the passenger side panel of my car a swift kick, denting it. I only noticed the dent after I got out of the car, but I had watched her get into her own car and drive away a considerable distance. I took photographs of the damage as evidence and already had security footage from the cameras outside my house to prove that my mother was responsible. I then called my lawyer and informed her of what had happened, expressing my desire to file a restraining order against my mother as well. So, that's happening now. It seems my mother just can't stand the idea of living a peaceful life and feels the need to disrupt everything all the time. I tried to file a police report, but since she's friends with the district attorney's wife, the precinct head told me his hands were tied and he couldn't assist further. It's okay, though, because I have the security footage showing her face and everything. I've downloaded and backed it up on my laptop to ensure I don't lose it. The next few days are going to be extremely stressful with all the court trips I'll have to make, but at least I'll be rid of these people. Update 3, hey everyone, it's been hectic lately with the divorce proceedings and everything. We're currently in the middle of settlement negotiations, and it's incredibly frustrating. At least I managed to secure a restraining order against my mother last week, so that part is done. Kevin and his lawyer have concocted a bunch of lies, so I'm working on gathering all the evidence of his infidelity for our next meeting, hoping that we'll finally put an end to this nightmare. It's annoying, but I'm attending therapy regularly to manage my anger and process everything so it doesn't interfere with my daily life. If I've learned anything from this ordeal, it's that I don't want to end up like my crazy mother. I just needed to vent here for a while, and I feel better now. I'll probably return once the divorce is finalized. For now, that's all.